So we'll go ahead and start. So black plays the Sicilian defense, and then here's the move order to get into the dragon Sicilian from this main Sicilian position. Black goes g6. And I want to continue talking about the Yugoslav attack today. So for the Yugoslav, white plays bishop e3, black goes bishop g7, white pushes f3, taking control of that g4 square, preventing knight g4, and of course intending to play g4 himself later on. And black here can play either knight c6 or castles, queen d2, and castles. And here is a key position where there are two main lines and one move that's become increasingly popular in this position. In our last couple of videos, we talked about this line where white goes ahead and castles queenside, and I recommended that black play d5. I believe I talked about that in videos part 2 and part 3 on the Sicilian dragon. And we've also talked a little bit about when white plays bishop c4, a very aggressive move to bring that bishop out to where it x-rays the king, and it can be a useful attacking piece later. And a third move that's gained a lot of popularity is this move g4, which was actually played in a recent game in the U.S. Championship this past year, a very exciting game, Nakamura against Robson. And that might be something that we discuss more down the road. But today I want to talk about bishop c4. So bishop c4 prevents black from playing d5, and the bishop can be very menacing, certainly, along this diagonal. So it's a very serious move that black has to be ready for. And the main move here for black is bishop d7, preparing to bring the rook to c8, where it can be powerful along that half-open c-file. So bishop d7, and here white normally castles or sometimes goes bishop b3 first. And now black can go ahead and play rook c8. This is one of the lines. And white would normally castle here, but in some cases he can play an early h4. These moves are somewhat interchangeable. What I want to discuss, in the first video, we talked about what happens in this position where after white castles, black goes knight e5, pawn to h4, and then knight to c4. And I showed a very interesting game, Karpov against Korchnoi, where Karpov won with white in brilliant fashion. Today, the topic of this video is going to be what happens when black doesn't allow the white pawn to go to h5. So in this case, let's say, for example, white plays the early h4. As soon as he plays h4, black has a defensive idea to immediately go pawn to h5 and not allow the pawn to go any further. Now, I have mixed feelings about this move, pawn to h5. I feel like in general, in a position where both sides are going to be castled the opposite way, you don't really want to move the pawns around your king, because in a lot of ways it makes your opponent's attack easier. However, white is already going to have a very strong attack, as black can do also in these positions, and I feel that by playing pawn to h5, it's a good way of slowing down white's attack and making it more difficult for white to attack in this position. And this line has become increasingly popular recently, played by a lot of the strongest grandmasters in the world, and I feel like it deserves a lot of attention. So we're going to discuss the line in this video, pawn to h5. So white castles and goes back to the normal position, and here black plays knight to e5. And here there are some different possibilities, so I'm going to talk about each of those possibilities, and then in my next video we're going to see a game that happened in this line between a a couple of heavyweight grandmasters. So one possibility for white is to play bishop g5. The idea is to have pressure sometimes on the e7 pawn if this knight were to move, and also to be able to capture this knight, which can be a key defender of the h5 pawn. So that's the idea behind bishop g5. Another idea is to go bishop h6 and try to trade the bishops. And then another idea here is to go king b1 and go ahead and tuck the king out of the way first, because this position is going to get very messy, and in a lot of positions it's important for white to try to have his king as safe as possible before the game really becomes crazy. So let's go ahead and talk about king b1 first. King b1 is an important move in all of these variations, and black should almost always answer it with rook to e8. Because rook to e8 is also an important move for black. For one thing, after bishop h6, it allows black to drop the bishop back to h8 and keep that dragon bishop, because now there's no rook on f8 that white's bishop could take. So it gives black that added option of dropping the bishop back and hanging on to that powerful dragon bishop. Another idea of playing rook e8 is that in some positions the white knight will come to d5, and the black queen might not be on d8 anymore, so if his rook were still on f8, then a knight taking on e7 could be a serious threat. But with the rook on e8, we won't have to worry about that. And the third reason for playing rook to e8 is sometimes when white's attack really gets strong, the black king might need to run. And now he has this f8 square available to escape to. So rook e8 is a very prophylactic move. So after rook e8, I want to start by taking you through an opening of a game that I played this last summer at the Badalona tournament in Spain, where I played against a very strong FIDE master named Obregon, who was from Cuba, and he was almost 2,500 FIDE. He had a very strong rating for a FIDE master, and he continued in this position by playing g4. So rather than playing bishop g5 or bishop h6, he immediately tried to crash through. And usually when white plays g4, it's necessary to take. Otherwise, they can take on h5, and their attack starts to become strong. So we go ahead and take on g4, and then Obregon played h5. He had the mentality, as a lot of players do in these kinds of positions, that it's okay to sacrifice as long as you can break through. So h5 in this position is almost always met by knight takes h5. And now he played bishop h6 with the idea of trying to trade off the bishops. And in some positions, a rook sacrifice on h5, which would really peel the defense away from black's king, could be a strong possibility. I'll just show you, for example, let's say black makes a move that really doesn't change the position at all. Here, white could play rook takes h5, and it would be very strong, as pawn takes h5 can be met by the winning move, queen to g5, with an unstoppable pin on this bishop. Of course, black can block that pin, but now we see the power of this light square bishop along this diagonal. White can simply play queen takes g6, and all the pins work in his favor. The bishop's pinning this pawn, the queen's pinning the bishop, and black is checkmated. So these are the kinds of ideas that we have to watch out for in this position, and it's important to make a useful move. And in this case, I played e6, which does a few important things. It blunts this bishop, so the bishop no longer has the pinning power along that diagonal. It frees black's queen, so black's queen can now have scope and come into the game at times and be an important defender. And this move even controls the d5 square, where a lot of times that white knight wants to jump to. So this move really does three things. Pawn to e6. And my opponent here played rook to g1 with the idea of strengthening his attack, putting his rook there and being able to take on g4 now with the f-pawn. Rook to g1. And I played queen f6, putting the queen on a useful square where it protects the bishop. And notice it looks like this move bishop to g5 traps the black queen, as it doesn't have any squares, but black has a simple tactical resource here to get out of that. He can take this pawn on f3 with the knight, attacking white's queen. So now if white were to capture black's queen, black can take with check. He can dump his knight off with check, taking this bishop, and then proceed to capture this bishop and be a full piece up in an easily winning position. And of course, if white plays knight takes f3, black can simply capture on f3 with his queen and save his queen from attack. So bishop g5 doesn't work. So in the game, my opponent made a mistake, and he played bishop takes g7. I took back with my king, and now he played pawn takes g4, and it looks very dangerous for black because the knight is under attack and the knight doesn't have many good squares to move to. And if the knight comes to f4, then my opponent can play g5 and kick my queen, and I won't be able to defend this knight. But this position, in fact, has already become practically winning for black. But it's important that he finds an important resource here on this move. And this might be a good opportunity for you to pause the video and see if you can find the continuation for black here. Okay, so here black plays the intermediate move, queen f4. And now my queen is aiming at my opponent's queen. If he were to take, I can simply recapture with my knight and have a very good position with an extra pawn in the endgame and well-placed knights. So my opponent played queen g2. He got his queen out of the way, and now I still have to deal with my knight, but I simply can play knight f6 with a three-way attack against this pawn. He played g5, but now my knight comes very nicely into g4, where these superfluous knights protect each other, and they're both very safe. And this pawn on g5, this once menacing pawn, has now become a sitting duck for my queen to pick off. And so I was able to have two extra pawns, and I won this game. If white were to play queen h3 here, black always has the resource rook h8, and the rooks defend very well. So let's go back to the position where my opponent made a mistake in what seemed to be a very natural-looking move. Bishop captures bishop on g7. But this actually was a very serious mistake. What white needed to play here is pawn takes g4 immediately, without the bishop there, without bishop captures bishop. So pawn takes g4. Now, once again, my knight really has no good squares, so I would need to play bishop takes on h6. And now, white can simply play queen takes h6. And here the position is very different. It looks like I can make the same move, queen f4, but here, white has a very unpleasant surprise in store. Rook takes h5. And now, once again, the queens are facing each other, and it's my queen that's unprotected. If I capture the queen, he can take back with his rook, and white's won a piece. So queen f4 is not possible here. However, I can play queen to g7. Queen to g7 is fine. And of course, white can't take here with the pawn because his queen hangs. And if he takes with the rook, now I can simply, here I wouldn't want to take his queen, but I can simply take his rook. And he can't take back with the g-pawn because it's pinned to his rook on g1. And black would have a good position. So taking on h5 doesn't work. Here, white simply needs to retreat his queen, and black needs to retreat his knight. And here the black king is safe. White's attack is not too powerful here. White does have some pressure, but it's nothing that black can't survive with his extra pawn. So let's return to this position after black played knight e5 on move 12. So king b1 is one possibility. A second possibility is bishop h6. Very often in the dragon, white wants to trade these dark square bishops to eliminate black's powerful dragon bishop. So bishop h6 is an extremely common idea in the Yugoslav attack. And in this case, black can't avoid the trade with bishop h8 because his rook is hanging on f8. So there are a couple of possibilities after bishop h6. It's possible here to sacrifice an exchange and really create a dynamic position, and you can do this by trading on h6 and then playing rook takes c3, and this somewhat typical dragon exchange sacrifice where that rook sacrifices itself for the knight on c3, ripping open white's king position and saddling white with doubled and isolated c-pawns, which can prove to be a serious weakness. It's not okay to immediately play rook takes c3 after bishop h6. This happened to me in a game once, actually, when I had the white side of this position, because there's a move here, bishop takes g7, which is a very powerful intermediate move, which attacks this rook on f8. So here, black needs to capture the bishop on g7, and his rook on c3 is lost, so he might as well get a pawn for it. Rook takes c2 check, but here white's position is very good. He can simply capture with the king, and after black captures the bishop on g7, white can tuck his king back to b1, and white is just up a clear exchange for a pawn, with black having absolutely no compensation here. So if black wants to sacrifice the exchange, he certainly can, but he has to take on h6 first and then take on c3. And then he can follow it up by bringing his queen out and attacking that c3 pawn, and it's certainly not an easy pawn for white to defend. He doesn't really want to retreat his queen here because white wants his queen for the attack, and in this position black would have a very natural move, a5, putting pressure on this bishop on b3 and really starting to march against white's king, and the attack is very strong. So normally here white plays king b1, and he's willing to surrender that pawn if black wants to take it. He wouldn't want to just start attacking here with g4 and attack blindly, because now after queen takes c3 there's a very serious threat. White can't get away with a move like this now because there's queen a1 check, which forces the king to d2, and then he takes this knight with check. So in this position after queen c7, white usually goes ahead and goes king b1, and it's possible to take on c3, but that pawn's not going anywhere. Black can just go rook c8 here, get his rook in the attack, and the idea for black is to continue with a5 and a4, whereas white at some point wants to get in g4 and have a very powerful attack against black's king. Now if white were to play f4 here, it's very important to go knight to c4. That knight needs to contend with white's bishop on b3. he wouldn't want to play knight g4 here because of this theme that we've already seen where the bishop pins that pawn, and here white can go queen takes g6 check. But as long as black goes knight c4 here, black is just fine, and it's a very dynamic game from this point. So this is one possibility for black against the bishop h6 variation. And another possibility is just to ignore the bishop on h6 and play the thematic move, knight to c4. So after knight to c4, white would take, black takes with the rook, and now white goes ahead and trades off that dragon bishop and plays the move that white so often plays in this line, g4, in order to try to break through against black's king. But here we're going to see that black is absolutely fine after this move, pawn takes g4, because black has all the resources that he needs to be able to defend his king. So here white would continue with the typical h5 to try to break through, and that pawn is always uncapturable in this line, because after something like knight takes h5, again rook takes h5, white can break through, queen g5 check, and now not a draw by repetition, but in fact it will be the rook that comes this time to the h-file, now that black's pawn is out of the way. So after h5, black plays rook h8. This is one of the benefits to having the black king on g7, is he has the defensive resource rook to h8, putting the rook on the h-file and closing down white's attack. So pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Now white plays pawn to f4 with the idea of continuing to press against black's king position. But black has a very nice resource here. He can go pawn to e5, striking out in the center and attacking white's knight. Now if white takes this pawn, black recaptures, and the knight needs to retreat here, in this case to e2, and here black has a nice move, rook to h3, putting his rook on a very strong square. And this position is usually drawn by mutual respect. White doesn't want to take black's rook and give him a protected pass pawn on h3, but it's not easy for black to play for a win either, because he has this pinned bishop and his pieces are not very well coordinated. So white would go here rook f1 with an idea sometimes of taking the knight on f6 with the rook and then capturing on d7. And so black can counter that with rook f3. And once again, white wouldn't want to take and allow black a pass pawn on f3. So he goes back rook h1 with the idea of going queen h6 check, like he wanted to do all along. And now black can counter that again with rook h3. And very often here we see a draw by repetition. The a little bit different variation will emerge if white chooses not to take the pawn on f5, but rather to go knight e2 right away. And now the threat is for white to take this pawn on d6 with his queen. So black plays rook takes h1, rook takes h1, and very aggressively knight takes e4. So the knights trade on e4, and now white goes pawn takes e5. And it looks like black's in trouble because now white has queen h6 check on the way. But there's no need to panic in this position. Black has the very calm resource, rook takes e2, the exchange sacrifice. Of course, when I say calm, I'm being a little sarcastic. You need nerves of steel to play this position with black. After queen h6 check, king f7, and the king here can be flushed all the way up the board to e5, but in fact there's no way for white to win this position. Black has enough resources to defend his king. For example, after rook h5 check, king f4, and even queen takes on d6 with check, the king just calmly marches up the board using his pawn, his rook, and sometimes his bishop as a key defender. And white has nothing more here than a perpetual. For example, queen d5 check, king f4, and queen d6 check, and a repetition of moves. So black is known to be fine in that position. There is an alternative for white after rook takes e2. Instead of going queen h6 check, he can take the rook. But now black has queen g5 check. Remember, we talked about how sometimes white makes the prophylactic move king b1 earlier, and it's exactly to avoid moves such as this. So queen g5 check, king to b1, and now queen takes e5, where black has two pawns for the exchange, and black is completely fine here. For example, if they go to the endgame, I believe it's black who's pressing to win this position with three passed pawns and an active king. So, going back to this position after knight e5, we looked at king b1, followed by g4, and we talked about bishop h6. Now we're going to talk about what's considered to be the main move, bishop g5. This is the most common move in this position. And in my next video, I'm going to show a game in this line between two of the strongest players in the world. So you'll definitely want to tune into that video, see more of the theory on this line, and to see an incredible game.